This is Bringing the Darkness to the Light with Catherine Nadal, professional psychic medium.
Today's guest is Denny Daniel. He is a curator and founder of the Museum of Interesting Things. Denny brings his traveling interactive demonstration exhibition of unique antiques and inventions to schools, libraries, and events, inspiring innovation and creativity for all. He has appeared on the History Channel, the Science Channel, New York One News, PBS, Channel 11, and over 20 publications, including the Smithsonian, Timeout, and the New York Times, and presented and spoke at 4 TED Talks. Denny is an NYU grad and often lectures there, as well as Columbia University. It's a pleasure to have you on, Denny.
Hi.
Hey, Denny. I know you and I have a very interesting way that we met. It was a couple of months ago. We were down at Generation Records down in the Village, and they were having a CBGB book that was being re-released, and the foreword of that book was being written by Chris Franz, and a lot of our common friends, such as Spencer Drake from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, being an artist for more than 25 albums there, introduced us. And once Spencer introduced us, you and I were chit-chatting with each other like we knew each other for years. So I said, I have to hang out with him. You know, you really are very, very creative, but more importantly, your amount of knowledge on almost every topic, really blew me away. After we spoke, I had, kind of followed up with you and said, just to let you know, I was in the military, and you said, come on downtown. You were having one of your speakeasies down on Prince Street, and it happened to be that night that you were showing kind of duck and cover films that were going back to the late 40s and early 50s. And I thought, wow, I said, this is a perfect opportunity, So I went to see your space. And of course, I love Prince Street and that historic neighborhood filled with nice eateries there. So let me see what you thought of meeting me and finding that perfect timing.
My God, I felt kind of the same way. And even now when you're mentioning it and you said, we met at the CBs, I'm like, no, we didn't. We've known each other for, what was it, at least a decade or two. It's just unthinkable. It's like, no, there's no way. We must have either known each other in a former life, or we grew up together and you were in that spare room at the parents' house that I didn't know about.
That's so funny. Yeah. Well, many of these interviews that I've done, a lot of my friends were in the music business, and we mention all of these neighborhood places, going back down, to the late 80s, early 90s. So it's possible I ran into you in one of those places. If not, it's definitely a past life.
Oh, there's no doubt I ran into you. And as you know, I was, besides the band performing all those places and me DJing, but I DJed more radio. I was the filmmaker at so many different places that I probably have incriminating footage of you somewhere.
Hopefully not. I don't think anyone has any incriminating photos of me.
There's probably incriminating photos of me also by you. So, we're even.
I don't know. That's very interesting. I want to go back to the beginning of it all because I don't know Denny as a young child. So were you a collector as a young child, or did this come from stuff your parents were involved in?
It was basically me. My parents think it's out of control. It's silly. But I've been collecting my whole life. Everything from Spider-Man comics to records, Beatles records, and all the records. My record collection is now over 1,000. It's over 2,000. And I it has to do with history. It has to do with fun. And I like patterns. So it's kind of all three.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when you mention records, I grew up and, very often I remembered being, probably 9, 10, 11 years old, asking my parents to go to Sam Goody, which was our record store in Yonkers. I used to go to the mall and I used to just stand there and stare at all these albums, just the covers of the albums, and then eventually having to decide on just picking out one album. So I remember my first album was Barry Manilow, and I was probably in the third grade. And it was the one that had Mandy on it, and This One's for You, and all of that. So I was just mesmerized by him. And, I found it very interesting because one of my best friends, a little girl named Cookie, that I had met in the fifth grade, she had siblings that were much older than us. So part of our fun on a Saturday or a Sunday were to go down to her basement and rummage through all of her sisters' 45s, which would have dated back, to the late 50s or early 60s, before our time. And we were playing around with some of these things, and I thought, geez, it's a little bit of a generational gap. We were listening to things that were probably, more than 20 years old at the time. So starting out with the records, do you remember what your first album was? Because mine was Barry, as I just told you.
That is so ironic because literally last week, someone donated their Barry Manilow t-shirt to me, and it's vintage from the 70s.
Wow, that's amazing. I've seen him several times. Wow, that's cool. What was your first album,
Never
though?
seen him. I've always wanted to see him. I had the album with him with the Beagles on it.
Oh,
That was
wow.
my first album from Barry. I've got a few of his records. Someone I used to know went to Radio City Music Hall concert and unfortunately didn't take me, but we kind of lived through it vicariously because I lived through it vicariously because she did call me during the concert and I got to hear some of it and see some of it. But I've always wanted to see him play. He just sounds like such a cool guy and a nice guy. And I added his work to the museum.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So I've seen him 5 times. I saw him.
Wow.
I know. I'm a bit of a
We'll have
fan.
to go. Take
I
me
know. I
next time.
have to bring you. That's right. But I actually saw him twice at Radio City. But other than collecting albums as a child, what was one of the things that you started to collect as well?
So, well, the first album I collected, I had, we had the same experience. My brother is 10 years older. My sister is 6 years older. Everyone was older than me. So I grew up with so many different, generations. So I got to grow up with the 60s stuff and the 50s stuff. And then I was very attracted to, the old stuff, the 20s and all that. But really, I was very into the 60s stuff. So I tried to buy full collections of the Beatles, the Doors, the Stones, Led Zeppelin, like all the different bands. I try to find full collections of them and get all this rare stuff. Ironically, it was a goth record store that was near my place, the Music Box, where the Ramones used to have signings. So they were very into that style. So I got into that style, the 80s stuff and the older stuff. But Let It Be was my first record. I begged my brother to buy it for me.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So you're mentioning more common friends. You and I are both good friends with Monty A. Melnick, who's the tour
Yeah.
manager for the Ramones, and a lot of great stories that he has as well. Yeah, it's interesting because when you go back and think about collecting items, one would think, growing up, that maybe my parents should have told me, don't open the box, and I did all sorts of things to my toys and, cut the hair on the Chrissy doll and all these things. And I never thought once that any of these things could be a collector item. Probably around 9 or 10 years old, I got involved with the kids at school. We used to flip for baseball cards, we used to throw the cards against the wall and everything. And I had a couple of cards, but we were flipping them, so they weren't in good condition. But Thurman Munson was one, and there was a couple
Wow.
of couple of names. But many years later, I tried to pass them off to be sold, and they said no, they're too damaged. But I had no idea. There's a whole nother world of collectors. There's actually levels of quality an item is in. And so how did you learn all of that while you were starting to collect your items?
In the beginning, it was just collecting. I wasn't, I didn't mind played with and touched. I just wasn't, anal like that. But I respect the people that, and now with the museum, I'll get things and it really has to be, it has to work if it's an item, because I'm doing the history of invention. with the Museum of Interesting Things. So I want them to work so that the kids can actually use them and touch them and play with them. Sometimes I'll buy extras of items so that I'll have one that is like, that's the glass case one. And then this one is the one that travels, that people touch, because for 100 years, people did use these items. So making them alive for people helps with the educational factor and helps with the inspirational factor, you know?
Yeah, it's very interesting when you say that. We were talking about you being a child, but then, I mentioned in your bio that you had gone to NYU. So when did you get involved in realizing your own self creativity?
I was an early adapter to that. I started writing before I could write. At 3 years old, I was already writing songs and coming up with songs. By 9, I had so many notebooks of songs that my cousin said, "You better start recording." So I started recording at 9. And at 13, I had my first band, and we played Brooklyn Tech for 2,000 people. The girls rushed the stage. They, they tore my pants apart in the front row. It was totally crazy. There's pictures, and there's an audio tape of it, and it literally sounds like a Beatles concert. To this day, I still don't believe that was the screaming girls. I still think that they funneled some sort of sound through the PA. And the teacher was like, "We don't know how to do that. That was the girl screaming for you guys." And I'm like, no.
What was the name of that band?
So that band was called Aberdeen.
Oh wow. So being 13, were the other members of the band all 13? Were you like an 8th grade
Yeah,
band?
yeah, we were all kids, and
Wow.
it was kind of a Beatles band, but it was an originals band because I wrote so many originals. So we split up the music, and I even sang the Beatles in German. I learned how to sing the songs, and we learned how to sing the songs in German. And it was kind of the band. I say it's my band, but it was really, our band. It was Mark and Scott. The first two members were already in a band, and then I kind of, joined it, and we ended up, forming it together as kind of an even, democracy. And I kind of really loved just sharing everything with, even though I'd written them at home, yeah, I felt like we all wrote them together and everything. So it was kind of a real Beatles situation.
So this is
And
the 1970s in New York City?
oh, I don't want to date that. Oh no, I think it was later. No, I think it was a little later than that, but I don't want to date.
Okay. All right. But we were
No,
we were in this we were in New York City, correct?
it was later than that.
All
It was
right,
in New
good.
York City. Yeah, I'm born and raised in Queens, originally Forest Hills. So I always consider myself a Forest Hills kid.
There you go. You got another Ramones connection with the Forest Hills. There you go.
Yeah,
Wow. Very
yeah,
cool.
that'll.
So going through high school with this band, and then you end up deciding to go to NYU. So once you got to NYU, what did you say? Like, what am I going to focus on? What's my major? What direction were you looking at then?
So I knew I wanted to go to NYU when I was 13 or younger, actually. It's probably 9 years old. My cousin, who was older than me, he was in this band that was a Beatles band that used to play Washington Square Park. So I fell in love with the village. And we were literally cutting school as far back as third, fourth grade. And instead of doing what normal kids do, getting drunk in a parking lot or something, we actually didn't get drunk at all. We didn't do anything yucky. We and got busted for going to bookstores and cultural events and stuff and learning about, culture and history and stuff and music. So I loved NYU straight back. And then in high school, my teachers went on strike. And that really inspired me to enroll in 4 universities: NYU, Hofstra, Yeshiva University, and Queens College. And I got straight A's in college while I was only getting B pluses in high school. So NYU got me in because of that. And I was kind of a different kind of person. So they had this weird experimental program they were starting where they were teaching people history and literature and art from the original books and the original stuff in the correct order of history. So starting with the pre-Socratics and going all the way to modern times. So I got 2 degrees there, one from that program, which we all became Just we had so much fun with that program. So that program gave me like literature, history, and art majors. And then when I got into the other regular school, I took international economics and international politics. So half of my degrees were boring and half were interesting, kind of.
Wow, that is so interesting. It's amazing how, at a young age, you kind of perhaps you're a little bit like me, Denny. I don't know. Maybe you were seeing into the future with your own, having the connection of seeing yourself at NYU. That's what we call manifestation, where you put yourself in the park with your friends and manifested, I want to stay in the village the rest of my life.
Yeah,
Something like it, right?
yeah. I ended up buying my apartment in the village.
Wow, it's amazing though, true. And not just doing the school part, but while you were in school, you stayed big in the band scene, correct?
Yes, yeah, I was playing everywhere, CBGBs and Limelight, and there was a club called Speakeasy we played at, and so many different clubs in the city. The gas station, Collective Unconscious, so many cool, really, really fun places. Almost nothing exists anymore, unfortunately.
Yes,
Um,
yeah, it's very interesting because one of my friends, owned a couple of places in the city, Tom and Jack. And, he's talked about it recently on the radio show here that one of the guys actually introduced the idea of doing in circuit TV, and any band that played in his club, they have video of them playing on stage. And the guy is putting it on YouTube now. So it'd be interesting to, have to pick your brain to see if you played at one of his clubs because he has this in circuit. There may be footage of you out there playing. I'll have
oh
to
my God.
connect you with Tom Jack. That is
Yeah, I
so
didn't even
great.
there was so many of us,
Yeah.
in the scene that, and yet
Wow.
it was like a small world, so everybody knew everybody. And I
Exactly.
love people, so I definitely, try to meet and learn about as many people as possible because I like friends.
Oh,
My
sure.
friends from elementary school are still my best friends.
Mine too.
The
Yeah.
college friends are still my best friends.
That's so great. And I know that you were connected. We had spoken about this briefly. You were also connected with the Limelight. You had done, was it photography or sound or both there?
So I started off with the band playing there, and then photography, film. So I was kind of the film guy at a lot of the experimental shows they were doing there, and concerts and stuff. And the band got to play there a few times. One of my high points. It was so great. And the manager is still a very dear friend. But that was the place I cut my teeth. I took so much footage at that place, including the last days.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. And that was like time capsule. In my mind, I think of, I could still see myself kind of walking around that place, and it's really, it's an iconic place. And many years later, it's turned into other things, it's obviously still there, but not the way we remember it. So that's so interesting. Yeah. So times have changed. So I really want to get into this because, for many years I was in the military. The last part of my military career, I was a senior instructor. So I'm used to standing up and delivering a class and presenting new material and quizzing people on it. What you do to me is so important because you're educating, but you're also engaging. People learn by having fun. And I learned that very early on in teaching that if you make, the exercise fun, or if you make it interactive where you have, students getting up out of their chairs or doing something physically, to make an impression on what they're learning about, they remember it so much more. So, how did you get involved in starting to do your demonstrations?
So it was kind of a happy accident. I was doing a lot of film work because I wanted my career to be creative, so film and design and all that. And I felt like I'd emancipated myself from the man, but I still wasn't doing something that was changing society. I felt like, the band wasn't doing enough and the film career wasn't doing enough to really inspire and change the world, do a mitzvah job. And I was kind of in this weird quandary and transition and trying to figure out what to do next. And my friends were throwing birthday parties in my apartment. And, I was, buying things that I thought were interesting and fun. And these, my friends had interesting friends, writers for Mad Magazine, Barry Liebman, writers for The Onion, DJs on WBAI. And those are my guinea pigs. I was kind of showing them the items. And I said, there's something about the energy of these items that's getting people to be positive and happy and curious and demystified. And at the time, I was like trying to pick a career, and I was thinking of actually, going to law school. I was pre-law at NYU. I worked at the Supreme Court, and I thought maybe I should do that. And I got accepted to a law school, and I thought, should I do that? And then I thought maybe this interesting thing, this museum idea, might work. So I tested it out in my elementary school in Queens, Solomon Schechter, and newspapers gave me front page articles on the first show. And they said they wouldn't even show up. And they gave me color pictures. And they said, you're not getting pictures. You're lucky if we show up. And we ended up getting 2-page spreads full of color pictures. I was like, whoa, I touched a nerve. So I kept deferring this law school for like 9 months until finally he said, Denny, you're getting in the paper, you're on History Channel, you're doing all these things. You're the kind of guy we want. Make a decision. We'll give you another 2 weeks. And I finally said, I think I got to play this out. I think nature's, opened up a door. And I tell my kids and I tell everyone, if nature presents you with something, if you get these opportunities, you should take them and do them. Because even if it's uncomfortable, because it's trying to put you in a place that you weren't expecting sometimes, and it wants you to do something that's important to it. So I ended up doing the Museum of Interesting Things, kind of coming out of those birthday parties and everything, and I don't look back. I think, it really did work, and I'm glad I made that decision over 10 years ago, believe it or not.
That's really incredible, though. A part of this whole schematic of your life has been a thought that kind of is paired with a dream, because in this conversation, you just always wanted to be happy. You wanted to make other people happy. And this thought of, collecting and then, bringing out these items during this birthday party, you realized made people happy. And then you thought, okay, well, this can make more people happy at a grander scale. So that's really impressive. Over the years, I've watched so many TED Talks. And when I first met you and you said you did one, I said, oh, I have to look that up. It's so prestigious, and all of the things that you've done have been so prestigious. I'm curious about the items, because a lot of times, even the night that I went to the speakeasy with you and you started to talk about a few things, for me, the knowledge was on the periphery. My parents had told me about the duck and cover. I had a few friends that actually were in school during the duck and cover days. Walking down the street in Yonkers, you could pass a very old elementary school and you could see where they have, the symbol on the side, which was considered like a bomb shelter alert. There's a couple of things in Yonkers where someone will point up and say, oh, you know what that was used for, certain things that they haven't removed, but they're not using anymore. There's a couple of things you probably would know about them, but there's one thing that I think has something to do with what we would call Con Edison now, but it was like a Christmas tree. It's kind of green and it stands on the corner and it looks a little bit like a Christmas tree. But it also has to do with like an alert booth. Some of these things were to make an alarm or to be an alert booth or, something like that, So it's kind of interesting how much history has been left in place. They just don't remove it. But they're also not teaching about it, which you therefore are, So I think that's really interesting. So what is the main stuff that you talk about when you go out to the classrooms? And then we could talk about the other stuff that you kind of move into more with adults.
So, and the museum has kind of 3 flavors to get people to see and experience it. So the first flavor, of course, is doing the schools, which is the most important mitzvah, good deed. Doing the schools, libraries, events, senior centers. The second flavor is the space where we threw those parties. My space on Broadway and 8th Street. People, email me and call me almost every day and say, I'd like to see the items. And I make an appointment and they come down and they touch everything and they learn from everything. And then the third flavor is the one that you went to every week on Sunday nights. We have what I call the secret speakeasy, but it's really about 16 millimeter films and antiques. And every one of those is a totally different theme because I can't do the same thing twice. And I show 16 millimeter films on the theme and bring the antiques on the theme, and people get to see the films on old 16 millimeter projectors from Kodak and touch the antiques and learn about them. So the museum has literally about 52 themes now because every week I do something different. But the main one, that one I did that very first time, is still the most popular one and the one that people love the most. I call it Eureka, the history of invention. And that one has just been the most popular because it's kind of a smorgasbord. Gives you a little bit of everything, communication, science, history, music, photography, literature, a little bit of everything is in that one. So that seems to be my main one and the most inspiring one. But I keep going down different rabbit holes.
What are the items that you bring to the school with the Eureka program?
So that one, the Thomas Edison cylinder record player is kind of my star, those wax cylinders and celluloid cylinders. Then camera obscuras and magic lanterns and stereoscopes from the 1880s. I bring all those and I let the kids touch them. A box wooden telephone. I have an attaché case telephone that I have them touch. And I literally will go through the audience and have them touch the item, or I pass it into the audience. And I've had 300 kids in the room. They are so sweet, so smart, so polite. Nothing gets broken, nothing gets lost. Everything is, there's such good, there's 15,000 on the email list, and I've met 15,000 people pretty much. And everyone has been amazing, just really, really cool. So, obviously I love what I do, and hopefully it does inspire.
Oh, absolutely. It's so interesting because when you started to talk about how you could touch the items, the night that I went to the speakeasy and it was the night of Duck and Cover, you talked about certain things that were done, during that era of war. And you had taken out, which was a pigeon carrier. And we actually got to touch it. And, then we saw it on the film. You had showed the film, and the film was like almost like an advertisement, showing them how the pigeon was wrapped and how the pigeon was secured and how they would put like a note with the pigeon. And, so we saw it hands on, and then you turn the film on and we were able to see that. So that to me was really very interesting. I also liked the part of the film where the person was kind of explaining how you kind of train, almost like you train a dog. You take it one step, then you go two steps, then you go three. And it's the distance, because at the time, like you mentioned during war, there's, many different stories about why they didn't get all the pigeons back or, and it's just to me so interesting, but yet to think, when I was in Iraq, we didn't use a lot of cell phones. It was really difficult to get a cell phone. We would wait online to call home, but the idea that even back then, they weren't using phones really at all, that they were guaranteed to send this pigeon off, so that piece is really interesting. I'd like maybe you could share that with the audience about that kind of knowledge.
It was, it's so funny how things happen by accident, and I'm like, and I go down this, this rabbit hole or pigeonhole. How did it happen? I was doing a video for a family, a very wealthy family that works with like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he has art all over his house, just a beautiful place. And in his son's room, he had a World War I soldier with a pigeon strapped to his side. And I thought, oh my God, that's incredible. So I took a photograph of it and said, I wonder if this is true. Did this really happen? And I went and I researched, and then all of a sudden I ended up buying, and it was the theme of one of the themes of my first TED Talk, the pigeon parachute. And it was on Science Channel also. We did an episode of that. And it was just so much fun. There were pigeon carriers made out of metal. I've got pigeon carriers made out of wood. It's amazing how secure that communication is. The only way to intercept a pigeon, because it's not radio waves, is to shoot it down. And then you still haven't technically found out what's going on. You didn't really intercept it, you just killed the message. You've got to go find the pigeon in the field and read what's on its foot to find out the secret that your enemy is saying. So it's not easy to do when you're dealing with bombs and bullets. So it really is a very secure method of communication if you think about it.
Wow, that is so fascinating, you know? And I love that story for the fact that it wasn't something that you really had a lot of knowledge of and that you just happened to come over and through a photograph, you know? And I find that to me really very interesting. There was also a couple of things that I thought of. You know, every time I'm in your presence, I think of things, and I wish my dad was here to meet Denny. My dad had such stories. You know, he was born in 1929, and he talked about being in school with a wooden desk, and he said that everyone had an inkwell and that they would go and they would kind of dip their pens in this inkwell, you know, and that's how they would write. And you figure he was in school, that would have been like probably like the mid 30s, probably, you know. And, you know, reflecting on it, you know, you go back and look at, you know, maybe productions on TV, you know, Little House on the Prairie or other things that, you know, you go back more than, you know, the time frame you think you're in. But to me, that stuff is very fascinating. And also things that he talked about, like being growing up in Brooklyn, you know, and it was a lot of things that were just what they would consider regular. Nowadays are not, you know. So my dad had a lot of stories about when he joined the Navy. He joined the Navy in the 11th grade, and his father had to sign him in because they were, you know, World War II kind of timing. So when he was signed into the Navy, they made him a hospital corpsman. And as a hospital corpsman, they were trained to basically do anything. You know, they trained them how to give medications and, you know, assist in suturing people up and stuff. And he told me this elaborate story about how they had to draw up penicillin and how they had to sterilize the needles and the glass syringes. And I was going to school as a nurse in the 1980s, you know, so I would come home with, hey, Dad, you know, we were taught how to do an IV today. And he would go back in time and start telling me the whole process of how they would have to prepare, you know, all of this equipment and all these supplies. And now, you know, in lightning speed time, we're dealing with things that are disposable, you know. So now syringes are disposable and, you know, needles retract so you don't get a needle stick and all these things that we think are now modern technology. You know, it's all part of, you know, the turning of the time. But medicine, so have you come across anything in collecting for medicine, changes in medicine?
Oh, a ton of stuff. And it's funny, we lived parallel lives again because my father was also a storyteller. So I think that probably influenced us. I like to think that I'm probably 1/10 of his amount of storytelling because that generation had such beautiful, elaborate, rich stories that allow us to tell those stories, you know, now that they're gone, because the kids really have to learn from that greatest generation and and that generation after and before that really made this country and this world, you know, so interesting. But as far as the quack medicine, yeah, I have a huge quack medicine exhibition. I just did it for the New York Health Department, actually in Albany, and I'm doing another one, a speakeasy soon, on it. And there's probably a couple of hundred items. And I like to say our quack medical show is to die for.
That's funny. When you say quack medicine, are you saying these were things that they told you you would be healed from, or just things that would really not cure someone? Is that the quack medicine?
So thank you for saying that because I always preface my talk about medicine, and especially when they, you know, quack medicine is such a fun word to say. But the truth is, all these things you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There was always at least one or more plausible uses for almost everything. It's just they would publish an entire book or purport all these other things that it clearly didn't do. It didn't cure everything. It wasn't a cure all. But often things get demonized, and then you throw out everything and you end up not having a solution that you could have had. So I always tell people, take things with a grain of salt, yes, but both sides with a grain of salt. Don't throw it away completely, but at the same time, don't believe everything you see at 3 o'clock in the morning, because that thing may end up as one of my quack medical items, a year or two later.
That is so funny. I know it's true though, but when you say these items, I was a very little girl in the early 70s, and my grandfather, my mother's father, had decided that, he was getting up in years or something, and he treated himself to the green chair. And all of us little kids would run around and say, "Who's going to sit in the green chair?" It was like this big. Till now, I mean, we're in our 50s now, but I mean, if you said to my cousins who sat in the green chair, they would say, "Oh my God, Grandpa's chair!" Like they were just known for that being Grandpa's chair. And the reason why it was the green chair was because it was an electric chair. And we would get in it, and you could press a button, and the thing would start vibrating and shaking. And, we thought it was the greatest thing, but it was defined of the day as a back massager, but the whole chair would like vibrate. We thought we were going to get tossed out of it, because we're so little, But to me, it's like such a thing of the time, when you think about it, that, they have them now, but they're probably a couple of $1,000s, and they're silent. They don't sound like the house is going to rock over.
I have, you remember you used to go to my family would say these motels and things, and often they would have this magic fingers thing that you put a quarter in or a dime in, and the bed would, shake and everything. And we would laugh our heads off about it as kids. And I actually got that device. It's a little vibrator that you actually attach to the metal springs on the bottom of the thing. And it was, one of the cooler ones are red, and it actually says magic fingers on it, which is so frightening. But yeah, my father also had one of these funny little electric chairs that you plugged in and everything. Every so often I had to turn the chair upside down and try to repair it for him. It used to drive me crazy, but that was his chair. And everyone knew it as Grandpa's chair too. I guess that's a thing.
Yeah, that is so great. A lot of these things for me are so great because it just makes you realize the changes of technology. And every once in a while, because, I say something, and my nephews who aren't that old, that starting college, not that old, I'll reference something and they'll give me this blank stare like they have no idea what I'm talking about. And it's like, wow, it wasn't that long ago. So there is, so many things happening and changing. There was just to talk about technology. We were recently talking, a group of us, and we were talking about phones. And they all make fun of me because I keep a landline in the house to do a proper radio show, Look, you're showing the camera one. I know we're on a radio show, but he's holding.
But look, wait, everyone listen and tell me what that sound is.
Yeah, it's not coming across, unfortunately. Yeah, but
What?
it doesn't come across. The sound doesn't come across on my end.
Uh-oh. But it's the dial of a dial
Yeah,
telephone.
yeah. So he's holding, and that phone that you had actually had the whole hand receiver with the top and the bottom. So what year would that have been, that
This
phone?
one would be probably early 1900s for that one. I have a candlestick phone also, that's early 1900s. But I have a history of communication, so I go all the way up to the iPhone. But I have the early portable telephones, like cell phones,
Oh,
the
wow.
brick,
Oh,
the
sure.
at the
Yeah.
shake.
So people may not remember that. So, Denny, can you bring them from having no cell phone to having a cell phone? Because every once in a while you'll flip on very late 70s kind of a movie, and you'll see a guy in the car holding this very big thing that looks like, a shoebox almost, and he's on the phone. So can you bring us through that telephone?
And it's funny because that phone, there's an episode of I Love Lucy where Ricky uses a car phone. And basically, the whole trunk was the mechanism, and you had the phone as a console in the front. But the rest was all the magic was in the trunk of the car. But it's basically a radio, just like they had in MASH units. It's just using a different frequency once you get to the cell technology. But at the end of the day, the phone that I'm using now to do this and that you're using all the time, that's a radio phone. Like radar used in MASH, it's just the cell idea is a different, the way the wave is going, putting it simply, it's a different, way to use the radio phone, but at the same time, it's still a radio signal. And they had that, believe it or not, in the I Love Lucy. And they were using it in the army. It's just it became the cell technology around 1973 when Martin Cooper came out with the first, official, cordless cell phone and made the phone call. I believe it's April 3rd, 1973, right off the streets of Manhattan. And when I teach kids, I always end my show because my mother would always call me. She had mommy timing and always interrupt every single school show. So I would always so I decided to write her into the show and put my attaché case cell phone, which is even more big and boisterous than the one that Martin used. And Martin's still alive, actually. He likes the museum. I spoke to him once. Um, but he's in California now, not New York. But I literally pick up, I tell the kids, I have to call my mom. She called. And then I slam the phone on the table and I pick it up and I got a rotary attaché case cell phone to make it even cheesier. He didn't use a rotary, of course. And then I dial it and I tell the kids, oh, did you think I was going to use a little cell phone? Well, these were the first, they were considered portable telephones. And I literally run through the audience and I have the kids hold out their hands and I slap the giant attaché case into their hands and it's probably 20 to 40 pounds. And I go, would you carry this around? This was portable back then.
That's amazing. Wow. Yeah. I do remember the really big one that you would see like in a Magnum PI episode or something where, the guy has the phone in the car kind of a thing. But I do remember also that you would remove it. Do you remember that piece of it where they had the car phone, they used to call it? They would actually plug it into, I think, the car lighter or something, and that they could actually remove it so it doesn't get stolen or something, right?
I've got, believe it or not, about six of those. They're the bag phones, and yeah, you could. They came in a little, black leather case, and you'd throw it like a handbag, and you'd literally put it on your shoulder and walk off with it. You charge it up with the lighter. I have a few of those. They're funny. Those are the ones people love and remember. I think Zach from Saved by the Bell had one, didn't he? Like everyone always
That
mentions
sounds
that.
familiar. Yeah, that does sound familiar. Wow. There were so many things back in the day. It just improvements of technology are amazing. When we were younger, we'd be on the phone. We were allowed to call our friends, we'd be talking. And then all of a sudden you would hear someone totally different conversation. And that was called a party line. And we would be like, oh my God, do you hear that other voice? That's a party line, And it was just like, oh my gosh. And then we were freaked out. We were like, hang up the phone because that means they can hear what we're saying and we can hear what they're
Right, let
saying.
me get a new line.
Exactly. That's so
Because that one
funny.
was corrupted.
Exactly. Wow. So it's interesting. We touched on medicine, we touched on the cell phone, we touched on the war related items. Can you tell me anything that would have changed drastically in cooking? There's been so many cooking shows over the years. Have there been any kind of inventions other than I can think of the microwave? But I mean, what would you say in regards to that?
So I do have a show called The Victory Dinner, which is based on the war rations program of World War One. And I'm dying to talk to one of these places like Fairway or Whole Foods and actually do a victory dinner where we use the war rations program. I have adults or kids go through the store with ration points, buy things that are in these cookbooks, and actually have them, have a cook there. And I prefer like an army cook do the actual Army recipes, the war rations recipes that are in these cookbooks, which are on my website. You can see the cookbooks, and the covers from 1943, 1944 are adorable. They're hysterical. You see, like the little girl slapping her baby brother's hand, like, don't eat the cookies before you eat the dinner, you know? But I mean, we were rationing, and people don't realize what that whole world was like. We had to feed the soldiers, but at the same time, we needed nutrients for the population here at the home front. And people didn't even know how to cook doing this, with this new system where you couldn't buy so much flour, salt, sugar, whatever was rationed. So the government came out with cookbooks, and that's why we end up getting fortified foods, because we needed to get the nutrients. So they had fortified cereals and breads and all these other things. And the idea was the nation also needs to be healthy. And then they start doing gardening, victory gardens, which were originally in World War I school gardens, and then in World War II they start rebranding them victory gardens. Now we have, like, in every part of this country, in the East Village of Manhattan, they would have these, gardens. Well, that goes back, it goes back to the beginning of time, but I mean, that whole idea of, victory gardens and all that very much comes from that war program. And almost everything we've talked about, there's like a progression. I call it the missing link factor, where you go from the carrier pigeon, smoke signals, all the way to your cell phone, where you go from, hitting a rock, all the way to a Thomas Edison wax cylinder player. All the links in the chain until you get to your cell phone is the whole purpose behind the Museum of Interesting Things. It's why I did it, so that people don't think their iPhones popped out of thin air and everything else.
This is totally incredible. I love that whole thing about the cooking. It would be interesting to see if you could pair up with maybe CIA, the Culinary Institute of America. I mean, they would be probably right on. I mean, they got the students right there. I mean, I would drive you to Poughkeepsie. I would take you right up there, Denny. Yes, it's right up there. It's up by Marist College, and they have more than one restaurant. You can go to the American restaurant, the French restaurant. They have many different restaurants. So we'll have to revisit that in 2025 summertime, because that would really be very interesting. Very interesting. There's a couple of things I want to make sure we get to before our time is flying. But I often think of things in regards to collections. My father worked for the Reader's Digest magazine in the early 1970s. He was there in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But during the 70s, he was part of Richard Nixon's campaign, only for the fact that the Reader's Digest magazine created a different magazine called Families, because Richard Nixon was focused on the family life. So he was part of creating that magazine for Richard Nixon. Now, if you were to go in real time out to California to the Richard Nixon Museum, that magazine my dad worked on is in that museum, and they sell them for $1 each. So, of course, when my father passed away, I found more than 40 of them in the attic, and I thought they were worth something until someone said you can get a brand new copy for $1. So I was like, okay. The reason why I bring up Richard Nixon was because those that worked on the magazine were invited to the inaugural ball. So my father and my mother were invited to the inaugural ball, and I was very young at the time. So they ended up, we went to grandma's and they went to the ball. But after, my father passed away, I found the invitation to the ball, and there was just, like these note cards that gave proof that they were at the inaugural ball. Do you have anything in your collection that's specified?
I don't have any of those in the collection, but it looks like something I definitely love to add to this is how a lot of the rabbit holes happen with me. Someone will show up at a speakeasy, a dear friend will mention something, and all of a sudden I'm like, this is fantastic. People you meet on the street sometimes, people you date, people you work with, will come up with something and you end up getting inspired. Someone that I went out with back ages ago in the 90s, early 2000s, she was into all this Masonic stuff and all that. And all of a sudden I have a whole show presentation just on that. I actually have the hoodwinks that they used and everything, and it teaches you how our voting system works. Because initially, the whole term blackballing comes from they had white balls and black balls when you voted for someone to be in the Masonic Lodge. So if you got blackballed, that means everyone put black balls. They didn't want you in the lodge. So that's where the word blackballed comes from.
Yes, very interesting.
So, you
Exactly.
mentioning the thing with Nixon, that's really cool your father did that.
Yeah. So the other reason why I brought it up was because my father had such a love for Ronald Reagan that he kept his picture in the living room. And when my father passed away, the funeral parlor director is a guy that we grew up with. And he said, take the pictures that are on the piano and bring them to the funeral parlor. Those are the family pictures. So we gathered them up and he said, put them on the table here. And we put them up and he walked by and he said, you have Ronald Reagan there? And I said, yes, because my dad thought he was a member of the family. So we brought him. He was always in the living room, and everyone thought it was a big hoot when they came into their funeral parlor and they looked at the family pictures and there was Ronald Reagan, just in his favorite picture. So there is a draw towards presidential items. And, just this past week, President Carter passed away. And when I was living in Virginia, George Bush Sr. passed away. And I actually stood online at the Capitol and I went into the rotunda and I saw, him laid out. And they give very particular cards. If you're there in person, you'll actually get a card with the photograph of the president on it. So there is items out there that are either inaugural or they are funeral related items. That may be a new topic for you
I
because
do have a funeral show, so that actually works.
it's
Works
very,
really show.
very, very interesting, the items that are out there. And the only way you would get that is to attend that. They don't give them out, So those things are very, very interesting. You may have a whole presidential thing that the reason why I
do.
bring it up because there's people I know that are really fascinated with JFK. Do you have any JFK items or JFK related?
I do, and funny enough, I've got some 16 millimeter film, amazing film of him. I think the inaugural address, but I also, believe it or not, some woman, such a sweetheart. She loved the museum. She spoke to her family, and they all agreed. And she said, "Come to my house. I'm going to donate a ton of stuff." And then in her basement, I saw this cheap looking black and white picture of John F. Kennedy. And I said, "Oh, that's fun. That looks interesting. That's cool, Kennedy." And she goes, "Well, do you want it?" I said, "Well, yeah, okay. It looks like a photocopy or something from a copy machine." And she goes, "It's actually kind of special." And she puts it in my hand and I go, "Why?" And she goes, "I had a crush on him as a little girl. And in elementary school, I sent him a letter and he sent me this back signed, and it's a signed picture from JFK that's in the living room at the museum.
That's
So it's one of my
beautiful.
pride.
That's incredible. Wow, what a lovely story.
I always say the only thing you leave behind is the people you touch. That's what you really leave behind. So the more people you inspire and touch, the more you're leaving behind for generations, because then they tell their kids and their kids tell their kids. I brought a few items that eventually we should try to go through the items that have sound so you can hear them.
We can do
But
that
one of
now,
them,
Denny.
okay. So the star of the museum, one of my favorite instruments, is the Thomas Edison cylinder record player. These played wax and celluloid cylinders. And here is one of them.
Wow, that's amazing.
Okay, so here comes the Zenith TV remote control. One of my absolute favorite of the remote controls. It's the Space Command remote control that I remember because I grew up with it. My parents had this remote. So right now, somebody's television is being changed in the 1970s.
Wow, that's so neat. It sounds so loud, the clicking. Now we just click the clicker and nobody hears anything.
I know I kind of miss the feeling, the touch, the tactile pressing the button and then hearing that noise. I kind of miss that. So kids went to Madison Square Garden to see the circus, like Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. So they would often get you these sparking guns. And I actually have one. And it actually does still spark.
Oh, wow.
Just don't do it in California.
Anything else?
Yes, a very, very important item in case you want to call the butler.
Wow. What is that?
So that basically is one of those hotel lobby bells to call the garçon, garçon, butler. And of course, our favorite that we all grew up with. That's part of my number.
Wow, that is the rotary phone, is it not? I heard that so clearly.
Yeah, that's a classic one. It's like something you'd see on the desk at the Addams family that Thing would use. And
And
one of the most satisfying things, hanging it up.
exactly, yeah. Wow, very cool. Anything else? This is so awesome.
Yes, off of a Japanese warship from World War II, here is an original wood and brass foghorn.
Wow, Jenny. You know, it sounds like you're blowing through it, but you're not. You're just pressing it together, right?
Oh, that's funny. Yes, I'm not blowing through it. Otherwise, I would be winded right now.
Exactly.
You're recreating your lungs with the
Exactly.
leather bellows,
Exactly.
basically.
Wow, this is so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing all these items. This is awesome.
You're
Wow.
welcome. This is one that your audience will love. Nobody was alive for this, but everyone knows the sound and the word. It's iconic. So that was called a Claxton. It's the Ford Model T car horn.
Oh, wow. That's very alarming, startling. I actually jumped. I was like, wow, what
Exactly. It
is
would be
that?
alarming. Okay, I'm going to
Wow.
add one last item, the Regina Calliope machine. This one is from the 1880s, but they go back 300 to 400 years. And it's one of the first programmable machines using metal records with holes in it.
That is beautiful. That is so
Isn't that?
nice. Wow. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It has been a pleasure to have you on, Denny, and can't wait to have you on again as a guest. We'll just drive the audience to come to your speakeasies on Zoom. They're available every Sunday night, and they are at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Do you have anything that you want to plug or make sure that the audience is able to check you out on?
Of course, the most important is schools. No matter where it is, the schools, I could do it live and virtual, but the most important thing is to get the kids to experience the items and libraries to experience the items and senior centers. Then the next thing, of course, if they're in New York, to come visit and see the space on Broadway and 8th. And then the third one also you can do from around the country. We have people that come in virtually every week, and that's the speakeasy where I show the films
Okay,
to.
great. And your website?
So the website, of course, is the Museum of Interesting Things, and I got the .com and the .org. And if you don't want to type a lot, Museum Things.
Very good. Well, it has been a pleasure to have you on, Denny. Thank you so much for sharing your talent, your knowledge, and your generosity with everyone here in New York City and throughout the country. Thank you again, Denny.
Thanks. You're so sweet.
Thank you.